Seafaring communities have given us some of the most vibrant civilizations known to our species. From the Polynesians, who sailed the early catamarans that became the speeding sailboats we know today, to the Vikings, who raided, plundered, and traded across Europe, even reaching Canada. Seafaring communities have made their mark on our memory as a species. How do you build such communities in your fantasy world? What are the things you need to consider? And how do you make your magic be a part of such a community? That is what I want to talk about today. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you've not yet done so, please do hit the subscribe button down below. And if you want to join my community of world builders, there is a link to the Discord server as well, and I do post in the community tab of this channel. Okay, let's get cracking with seafaring communities. First, there are some universal elements of seafaring communities to consider before we start thinking about the things that differentiate them. A seafaring community almost always requires people who are adventurous in nature. It takes a fair bit of I want to see what's on the other side of this piece of water to get into what amounts to a very large wooden bucket and sail off into the unknown. So you're probably not talking about a cautious type of people here. It is very common to have seafaring communities. We probably invented the ship before we invented the wheel, and the wheel is pretty old. Trading is often a large part of the community, with known trade routes and trade-friendly cities being very important knowledge held in trust by the community and shared with their trusted members. Fighting and being physically capable is highly prized in most seafaring communities, not just because of things like harmful fauna like sperm whales or sea dragons, because this is fantasy, but also because of potential raiding if you can't trade, and that is to say you're raiding because you can't trade, because of fending off raiders, and because of fending off pirates on the high seas, as well as coping with shipwrecks. So generally speaking, these people, while they might not be warlike, are certainly competent and knowledgeable in the arts of fighting. So those are some general things to think about when you're building your seafaring community. But what about the specifics? How did we get the Polynesian seafaring community on the one hand and the Viking on the other, both seafaring communities, but so different in many of their cultural aspects? Let's dive into the weeds a little bit. The Polynesian people live in the Pacific Ocean. Now, while it is a vast ocean, it is not as cold as the Atlantic Ocean, where the Vikings made their home. So this naturally led to the very divergent clothing styles, because the Vikings very much needed to protect themselves against the cold of the elements. Very important that you protect your extremities, and your male genitalia is critical to protect in that kind of weather, and hence the very different styles of dress. But they also had rather different boats. The Polynesian boat is called a catamaran, and it is built in the outrigger style, generally in the double-hulled style. Catamaran actually means tied wood, because the Polynesians didn't have access to a lot of iron on their islands. So they tied the hulls of their ships together in order to build their catamarans. This actually had a couple of unexpected advantages. The one is that it makes the ship lighter, so it moves faster, and indeed modern day catamarans are some of the fastest sailing ships you will see. They are so fast they actually rise out of the water and almost skim across the surface, the fastest of them. It also had the advantage of giving the hull flexibility, allowing it to traverse the Pacific storms and to traverse the shallow drafts around the reefs that build up in the Pacific Islands, because of course the Pacific Ocean, being warmer, has a lot of coral reefs, and coral reefs present a great challenge to ships with deep drafts or ships with inflexible hulls. So that is why the Polynesian ships looked the way they did. Now, the Viking ships are also an outgrowth of the kind of resources they had. Naturally, they had a lot of trees available to them. If you ever travel up here to the north, you will know one thing we have in spades is forests. But they also had access to a lot more iron. So I think that is likely why they went into oars as well as sails for their ships, because they had sufficient wood and iron resources to allow them to have oars as well as the hull itself. What is interesting to me during my research of this is I learned that Vikings actually used baleen to tie their boats together. Now, baleen is what you find in a blue whale's mouth. It's those kind of cords. And they heated the baleen and formed cord out of it. Now, tying their hulls with this baleen cord did the same for them as tying the hulls of the Polynesian catamarans did for the Polynesians. It gave the hulls flexibility that allowed them to survive the Atlantic storm. So I thought that was a very interesting little factoid, and if you enjoyed learning about that, hit the thumbs up button. So those are their clothing and their boats, which are both kind of climate and resource driven. But those aren't the only differences between the Polynesians and the Vikings, of course. One of the other key differences between these two cultures is how they celebrate things and what their lifestyle is. The Polynesian lifestyle is a much more open-air beach lifestyle. Again, this is predominantly climate-driven. Their festivals would make sense to have on the beach, fish barbecues and that kind of open-air celebration. Viking celebrations tended to be more focused on inside the home and tended to be storytelling, sweat lodges, that kind of activity. Because obviously, the Viking climate, the climate up here in the far north, does not lend itself to many open-air celebrations, except in summer, when, of course, the Vikings had the midsummer celebrations. Both cultures appeared to have venerated their dead quite deeply. The Polynesians created the moa, which are statues that you find on Easter Island, that were the honored dead of a given lineage. Vikings buried their dead with ships, and some of our best burial sites for Vikings have shown us what their grave ships looked like, the ships they built specifically to bury their honored dead with. So thinking of these two communities, these two type of seafaring communities, there are some specific elements that you can think about when you're building your seafaring community. What type of festivals would they have given their climate, and when would those festivals take place? Their clothing would very much be a product of the nature of their climate, which of course extends to the nature of the sea on which they live. Their ship design would be based on the resources that they have available. So lack of iron leading to catamaran hulls, the availability of baleen to make cords with, allowing the Vikings to make the flexible hulls of their longships. Now, on the topic of resources available to make ships with, I feel that I should talk specifically around a fantasy element, and I am going to reference Robin Hobb's Liveships. So this is your spoiler warning. I am going to spoil a huge part of Robin Hobb's Liveship Traders series. If you don't want to hear the spoiler, use the timer marks down below to skip on to the chapter on navigation. So in the Liveship series, the ships are made of a wood called wizard wood, which was discovered by the Rainwild traders when they excavated the elderling city of Frigong. Hopefully that's pronounced sort of correctly. And they discovered what they thought were logs there. When they split the logs open, inside they found these pale carcasses which the traders discarded, and they used the logs to make their live ships with, after it turned out that these logs were immune and undamaged to the acidic rain of the Rainwild River, which of course made them incredibly valuable. What the traders didn't know is that the logs were dragon cocoons that included the dragon memories. So when the dragon was born, it was supposed to consume these memories. The sentience of a live ship is therefore a combination of the dragon spirit in the log and the human memories absorbed during the ship's use. So that is a very great example of a specific fantastical resource only available to one type of seafaring community. And of course, that seafaring community then rose to be a very dominant force in their world because of that resource. If you enjoyed learning about these resources and their impact on seafaring communities, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about the importance of navigation. For all seafaring communities, navigation is a critical part of their life. The reason why is obvious. Getting lost at sea is a terrible end result of a voyage. So navigation was always important to a seafaring community, and this leads to certain important elements of your community. So first, let's talk about the obvious one, which is stars. Stars have been used to navigate for millennia. Star charts have been carved into rocks, they have been created using shells, they have been mapped out on paper. This kind of navigation using stars is also assisted by things like having myths about the stars, like those 3 stars being Orion's belt and all those kinds of things. In part, your community could use those kinds of myths and stories to remember where the stars are supposed to be so that you can use them as a navigational tool when you're sailing at night, or even just as a navigational tool to determine direction for when you sail the next morning. This, of course, leads to an interesting situation if the characters are on a ship and there's a massive storm and they're blown to the other hemisphere of your world. And now when they look up into the night sky, the sky is wrong and their navigation stops working, which is a massive challenge to overcome on a ship. So there's an idea for you for some conflict if you're writing ship-based adventures. There are other things than stars that we have used to navigate with. The movement of birds is very much a key element of the Polynesian navigation. There are certain birds that fly out to sea in the mornings and they fly back into land in the evenings. So if you're looking for land and you see those birds flying, follow the birds and they will take you to land. This is especially useful, obviously, during exploratory voyages where you're not necessarily going to a specific place, or if you're lost or have been blown off course. There is also utilizing landmarks, so what the swells look like, coral reefs, cliffs, specific colors of the water. There's also things that you can do from a fantastical elements, like permanent set whirlpools in a given location of your ocean that, would send out specific kind of waves. Or if you have a more advanced society, beacons that would send out alarms, or magical beacons. Maybe there are magical lighthouses that would tell a ship where it is. Or if you're looking very advanced, the way that Warhammer 40k does the navigation, where the navigator looks towards the Emperor, whose mind is a beacon in the warp, You could use that kind of navigation even in a seafaring community with a strong enough magical center point that a mage could then look at and determine distance from and therefore determine location. But if you don't want to use magic to do that, there is a way to determine your exact location that does not require Google GPS, and that is latitude and longitude calculations. So latitude is not that hard to calculate. All you need is a crossbeam or a sextant or some tool like that that allows you to determine by the light of the stars or the noon sun where you are on the latitudinal lines of the Earth. But longitude provided a severe problem because for longitude, you need to know not just where you are in the ship, you need to know what the time is at your starting point so that you can calculate in 15-minute increments where you are so that you can find the place where your latitude and longitude crosses. After 3 English ships crashed on islands called the Scillies, because they were in the wrong place, even though they had calculated their latitude correctly, there was a competition run to create a clock that could accurately hold time while on a ship, because pendulum clocks were useless on a ship due to the motion of the ship. The shipboard chronometer was finally invented in 1761 by a man called John Harris. It had bearings and it was spring-loaded, allowing it to keep time accurately even with the movement of the ship, because it would move with the ship and still retain its time. And with that ship's chronometer, it then became viable to calculate your longitude, and navigation became a science. The reason why the GMT line is in London and the reason why we talk about the zero time, the GMT time zone being London, is because John Harris was, of course, English, and that is where they drew the line and measure the longitudinal lines from around the rest of the globe. So what does all this navigation mean for your seafaring community? It is likely that your seafaring community would have rhymes to remember things like landmarks, trade routes, the position of the stars in the sky, even mechanisms for calculating your navigation could be transformed into rhymes that you say, little rituals that you do that tell you where you are. You'd also likely to have proverbs like follow the gull out and the tern in. You would likely have kids' games that teach kids how to navigate on the ocean, things like filling in star charts or putting down rocks in the right order, or hopscotch type games where you jump on the right location to learn navigational aspects. And lastly, your community would probably have instruments specifically for navigation, like the sextant or the ship's chronometer, or magical equivalents if your magic is deeply entrenched within your world. If you like learning about navigation and its impact on seafaring communities, hit the thumbs up button. And let's delve a little deeper into the fantastical aspects of seafaring communities. So obviously, magic, the magic that your people do, could have a large impact on seafaring communities. If your magic allowed for the fabrication of things like boats, your mages would likely be celebrated within a seafaring community, especially if your magic allowed for things like making hulls flexible, protecting against damage, or finding resources with which to build the ship would be great for your seafaring community, and mages would thus be celebrated as shipbuilders were celebrated in both the Polynesian and the Viking culture. Weather control would obviously be very useful to seafaring communities in general and on a ship specifically. And of course, magic would have an enormous effect on powering the boat. If your magic allows itself to be used to power vehicles, like for example the waterbenders in the swamp in Avatar: The Last Airbender, or perhaps capturing a spirit and using the wind spirit to fill the sails of your ship to drive it forward so that you don't actually need a wind and you can just sail anywhere you like. Or maybe something like having a steam-powered boat, but you use magic to heat up the water rather than coal. Then your mages would also be very celebrated, but unlike, say, celebrated like the ship's builders, your mages would be part of a ship's crew, and any ship's crew that didn't have a mage would be seen as being crippled. And if there was a accident or a shipwreck, obviously it would be critical to save the mage, because otherwise you can't go anywhere. So those are all things to think about in terms of your magic and your seafaring community and how your magic users fit into your seafaring community. But there is also fantastical fauna and flora. Of course, you can release the kraken and have sea monsters of all sorts. But what about having sea creatures that are also domesticatable? You could potentially solve your propulsion of ships problem by having creatures that can tow the ship or that can push the ship. And that would allow you to also overcome your dependence on the wind. Potentially, you could have creatures that you can tame that could herd fish towards your communities, which can solve a lot of your feeding problems and give you a great deal of trade elements, especially if you could have these creatures actually herd the fish between communities. So you could, for example, take a school of fish and guide it along behind a ship and use that school of fish as a trade resource in another community. Kind of like how you could take a whole herd of sheep to market on land. You could apply the same principle in the ocean with these kind of domesticatable sea dogs. And then, of course, you could have the sea have magical resources like snails that you can harvest for potion components or the like. Now, that's all very fine and well for animals. But what about if you have aquatic races, aquatic sentient people? Well, there are two ways you can approach it. Either your land dwellers and your sea dwellers could be at war with each other and fight over resources of the sea. Or you could have them be neutral to each other and ignore each other because they don't know and don't care. Or you could have them be sort of twinned communities. So a seaside town with an underwater equivalent that work together and that provide each other with appropriate resources both for trade and survival. And if you enjoyed thinking about the fantastical elements associated with seafaring communities, hit the thumbs up button. I do want to speak about one other type of seafaring community, and that is the seafaring community of a trade empire. And here I will specifically draw on the Phoenicians of our world. The Phoenicians actually never described themselves by that name, as far as we know. Phoenician is derived from a Greek word meaning purple dye. Now, the purple dye came from sea snails that only lived in the waters around the Phoenician city of Tyre. And that purple dye became one of their most prized trade goods because it was so rare and so pretty. What the Phoenicians did was they sailed within the Mediterranean. So this kind of trade empire develops best if you have a closed sea with lots of people that you can trade with. And as they sailed to places, they didn't fully colonize most places. Instead, they set up trade routes and trade treaties. And they built cities here and there, but those cities weren't part of like the Phoenician Empire. They had treaty agreements with each other. So each city had its own ruler, and they all were part of this vast trade network that was the Phoenician Empire. Now, their trading networks, in fact, extended all the way to Cornwall, where they traded for tin. So it was a really impressive trade network. Their ships were built for trade, and they were these big-bellied ships that sailed around the Mediterranean. They also were great artisans. Why? Because they would go take raw materials, then come back with those raw materials to their city-states, work the raw materials into finished products, and then sell those. So if you're going to build a trader-type empire on the sea, think about things like what governs the city-states that form this empire. How do they establish friendly harbors with cities that aren't necessarily part of their core trade empire? What are their artisans like, and what raw materials do they bring back to work with? And remember that these trade empires work best when they start in closed seas and then expand outward from there. And they're unlikely to just spring up in open seas. They also very definitely need other nations to trade with. The Polynesians, for example, would have struggled to establish that kind of trade empire given how spread out their islands were. That kind of trade empire developed best in the Mediterranean, where you had a plethora of civilizations all available right there on the beach. And those are my thoughts on seafaring communities in a fantasy world. If you'd like to help me make more of these videos, links to my Ko-fi page and my book on Amazon down below. And if you'd like to check out more of my videos, I've done a video on having a magical navy right over there, or any of my other videos on my channel, and I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.